A Gilded Age woman could forget her gloves, misplace her parasol, even step out without jewelry, but she never left the house without her hat. It was the first thing the world saw and the last thing she removed, because those elegant crowns of silk and felt existed for a reason far more serious than fashion. In an era where women were observed, judged, and measured the moment they appeared in public, the hat became a quiet line of defense. Its brim shaped how a face was seen, how long a gaze lingered, how much of a woman's presence was offered, and how much was withheld. What looked decorative was carefully engineered restraint. What appeared graceful was, in many ways, survival disguised as style. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden rules and unspoken truths behind history's most polished eras, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, city, country, or quiet corner of the world. Because once you understand why Gilded Age women wore elegant hats, you begin to see how beauty itself was used to manage danger, reputation, and control, all without ever saying a word. In the Gilded Age, the rule was so complete it no longer required explanation. A woman did not step outdoors without her head covered, not briefly, not casually, not even to cross the threshold and speak to a neighbor. To do so would have felt less like a fashion misstep and more like a breach of the self, as though something intimate had been left exposed to the street. The hat was not an accessory added at the end of dressing. It was assumed from the beginning. Clothing was assembled upward toward it, each layer working in quiet cooperation to support what rested on the crown. Hair was pinned and tightened not for comfort, but for stability. The skull itself became a foundation. Only once the hat was secured could the body be considered complete enough to be seen. This expectation did not announce itself. With threats or instruction, there were no posted rules, no pamphlets warning of consequences. Instead, the pressure lived in glances that lingered too long, in pauses that stretched uncomfortably, in the subtle withdrawal of respect that followed any deviation. A bareheaded woman did not cause outrage. She caused unease. She unsettled the delicate order by appearing unfinished, as though she had arrived without her social armor. From childhood, girls learned this instinctively. Hats were placed on small heads before memory could resist them. They were adjusted by mothers, governesses, and shop assistants with practiced hands, teaching posture through pressure. A child learned to hold still not because stillness was virtuous, but because movement threatened collapse. In this way, the body absorbed discipline without language. The habit became muscle deep. The absence of a hat suggested vulnerability, but worse, it suggested intention. To appear uncovered implied carelessness or defiance, and neither was tolerated in a society that equated restraint with morality. A woman who went bareheaded invited interpretation. Was she unwell, unstable, improper? The street did not ask kindly. It speculated freely. Hats solved this problem by saying everything at once, without speech. They announced class through materials, respectability through condition, propriety through placement. A hat too small hinted at frivolity. One too large suggested pretension. Tilt carried meaning. Height carried authority. Even silence could be read in the curve of a brim. Yet the power of the hat lay in its quietness. It allowed a woman to move through public space while surrendering as little of herself as possible. The head, seat of expression and recognition, was softened, shaded, partially concealed. Faces became harder to read. Eye contact could be deflected without refusal. The hat provided a sanctioned ambiguity, a way to be present without being available. This was not framed as protection, though it functioned as such. It was described instead as correctness, as polish, as dignity. Language wrapped necessity in elegance until the reason disappeared beneath the ritual. Over time, few remembered why the rule existed at all. They only remembered that breaking it felt dangerous. A woman who forgot her hat might feel the mistake before anyone spoke. The air itself seemed sharper, the street louder, her reflection in shop windows unfamiliar, almost indecent. She would hurry, lower her gaze, sense the imbalance in her own silhouette. Something vital was missing, and the world knew it. Thus, never bareheaded was not merely advice. It was a condition of movement, a prerequisite for safety, recognition, and social invisibility all at once. The hat did not elevate the woman wearing it. It allowed her to pass. Before a woman spoke, before she was greeted, before she was judged worthy of acknowledgement, the hat intervened. It stood between her and the world as a preliminary negotiation, a silent emissary sent ahead of her presence. In the Gilded Age, nothing met the public air without mediation, and the head was the first point that required restraint. The city was not a neutral space. Streets pressed inward with noise, soot, heat, and scrutiny. Shopfront glass reflected faces back at themselves, distorted and multiplied. Men paused. Women assessed. Every movement invited assessment, and every assessment carried consequence. Into this environment, the uncovered head would have entered naked, unfiltered, offering expression too freely. The hat prevented that exchange from becoming immediate. It functioned as a soft wall, not a refusal, but a delay. A woman's features were not delivered all at once. The brim intercepted light, altering angles, obscuring intention. Foreheads disappeared into shadow. Hairlines softened. Eyes could look out without being fully returned. The hat changed the mathematics of visibility, redistributing attention away from flesh and toward form. This barrier was carefully calibrated. It was meant to be noticeable, but not interrogated. Its success depended on its acceptance. A barrier acknowledged as such would have failed its purpose. It had to appear decorative, even indulgent, to disguise the fact that it controlled access to the woman beneath it. The head had long been considered a site of vulnerability. It held thought, recognition, expression. To expose it entirely was to offer too much too quickly. Victorian culture distrusted immediacy. It favored gradual revelation, regulated contact, controlled proximity. The hat answered this preference by making the encounter incremental. One saw the outline before the face, the suggestion before the detail. This mattered profoundly in public interactions. A woman entering a shop, a carriage, a lecture. Hall was assessed instantly. The hat established her position before any word was exchanged. It framed her as respectable or questionable, modest or careless, worthy of politeness or correction. Without it, she would have been forced to negotiate her presence directly, and direct negotiation was rarely safe. Even within female spaces, the barrier remained. Drawing rooms, parlors, and visiting hours all observed the ritual of arrival. The hat stayed on until permission was implied. To remove it too early was intimate. To keep it on too long was aloof. Timing became another language, understood instinctively and corrected mercilessly when misused. The barrier also disciplined the wearer. A hat required stillness. Sudden movement risked imbalance. Gestures became smaller, more contained. The body learned to anticipate the object it carried. In this way, the hat did not merely protect against the outside world. It shaped the woman inwardly, encouraging composure as a physical necessity, rather than a moral aspiration. There was comfort in this arrangement, though it was rarely named as such. The barrier allowed women to endure public exposure without full participation. One could attend without inviting, observe without engaging, exist without explanation. The hat absorbed attention that might otherwise have fallen on expression, emotion, or fatigue. Over time, the barrier became invisible precisely because it was everywhere. Its absence, however, remained conspicuous. Without it, a woman seemed unfinished, improperly introduced, exposed too soon. The first barrier, once removed, revealed how much it had been doing all along. Thus, the hat did not merely sit upon the head. It stood guard, it filtered, it delayed. It translated a woman into an acceptable shape before the world was allowed to see her at all. No decree announced it, no statute enforced it. There was never a moment when a woman could point to a page and say, "Here, this is why I must cover my head." And yet the rule was absolute. In the Gilded Age, few expectations were followed more faithfully than those that were never written down. The absence of law did not weaken the rule, it strengthened it. A regulation that lived only in custom could not be appealed, challenged, or amended. It existed everywhere and nowhere at once, enforced not by officials but by atmosphere. One learned it the way one learned to lower the voice indoors or avert the eyes at certain moments, not through instruction, but through consequence. A woman discovered the rule the first time she considered stepping outside without her hat. The hesitation arrived before the action. Something in the body resisted. The hand paused. The mirror reflected not defiance, but unease. This was not fear of punishment. It was fear of exposure without protection, of being seen incorrectly, of standing out in a way that could not be explained away. Social order in the Gilded Age depended on such invisible agreements. Respectability was maintained not through force, but through consensus. Everyone participated because everyone understood what happened to those who did not. A woman who appeared bareheaded did not need to be confronted. She would be corrected by the silence that followed her, by the altered tone of conversation, by the subtle recalibration of how others placed themselves in relation to her. The rule persisted precisely because it was framed as natural. Hats were described as tasteful, becoming, appropriate. To suggest they were mandatory would have revealed the fragility beneath the elegance. Instead, obligation was recast as preference. Women were said to choose their hats, to delight in them, to express individuality through millinery. The choice, however, existed only within narrow borders. One could choose style, not absence. This unspoken law was taught early. Girls watched their mothers prepare to go out, observed the sequence without question: shoes, gloves, hat. The order was as fixed as breathing. No explanation followed, because none was required. By the time a girl reached womanhood, the rule had already lodged itself too deeply to be named. Men, for the most part, did not articulate the expectation either. It operated beyond conversation. A bareheaded woman, unsettled not because she violated male authority, but because she disrupted a shared illusion of order. She reminded everyone that the system relied on compliance, not inevitability. That reminder was unwelcome. The absence of written law also ensured flexibility and enforcement. The rule could be applied harshly or gently, depending on class, age, and circumstance. A wealthy woman might be indulged briefly. A working woman might not. The same action could be dismissed in one context and condemned in another. This variability kept women uncertain, encouraging caution rather than resistance. Importantly, the rule allowed society to deny its own severity. If there was no law, there could be no cruelty. Discomfort could be blamed on impropriety, not punishment. Consequences were reframed as natural reactions rather than social discipline. In this way, control appeared reasonable, even benevolent, yet the rule was never truly optional. To ignore it was to accept isolation, speculation, and loss of standing. The cost was not immediate, but cumulative. Invitations stopped arriving, conversations shifted, trust thinned, all without accusation, without record. A rule without a law is the most enduring kind. It requires no defense because it is never questioned aloud. And so the hat remained where it had always been, on the head, before the door, before the woman herself was allowed to enter the world. Elegance was never described as a burden, yet it functioned as one. In the Gilded Age, a woman was expected to appear graceful, not as an achievement, but as a baseline condition of acceptability. To be elegant was not to excel, it was to comply. The hat sat at the center of this expectation, transforming beauty from expression into responsibility. Elegance was framed as natural, something women were presumed to possess instinctively. This presumption was convenient. It erased the labor required to maintain it. Hours spent pinning hair, adjusting balance, selecting materials that would neither offend nor invite comment, were dismissed as inclination rather than effort. The obligation hid itself inside admiration. A woman who appeared elegant was praised for taste, not endurance. Yet endurance was exactly what was required. The hat demanded physical submission, its weight pressed downward, reminding the wearer to hold her head a certain way. Its structure restricted movement, punishing haste and spontaneity. A misstep could send pins shifting, balance faltering, composure unraveling. Elegance required constant vigilance. This vigilance extended beyond the body into the mind. One learned to anticipate how one would be seen before being seen. Streets, rooms, gatherings were navigated mentally before they were entered physically. Would the light strike the brim too sharply? Would the height appear excessive? Would the color suggest boldness rather than refinement? Every choice carried interpretive risk. Failure to meet the standard was rarely forgiven. A woman who appeared inelegant was not pitied. She was corrected, sometimes gently through suggestion, sometimes cruelly through silence. The absence of elegance was read as absence of self-control, absence of upbringing, absence of worth. Circumstance did not excuse it. Fatigue did not absolve it. Illness might soften judgment, but only temporarily. Elegance thus became a form of moral currency. To possess it signaled discipline, restraint, and reliability. To lack it suggested instability. The hat, perfectly arranged, became evidence. It testified on the woman's behalf before she spoke. It reassured others that she understood her place and would maintain it. This obligation extended across classes, though its expression varied. Wealth allowed for extravagance but not exemption. Poor women faced harsher scrutiny as elegance was treated as proof of deservingness. A worn hat, carefully maintained, could earn more respect than none at all. Even scarcity did not permit neglect. The most punishing aspect of this obligation was its invisibility. Because elegance was framed as virtue rather than labor, women who struggled with it appeared deficient rather than overburdened. The system offered no acknowledgement of effort, only judgment of outcome. One was elegant, or one was not. The process did not matter. Over time, many women internalized the demand so completely that it felt self-generated. Discomfort became normalized. Pins biting into the scalp, weight pressing on the neck, heat trapped beneath felt. These sensations were accepted without complaint. To complain would have suggested ingratitude for beauty, misunderstanding of one's role. Elegance, then, was not an adornment. It was an expectation, enforced through admiration and withheld through shame. The hat was its most visible instrument, transforming survival into style and obligation into ornament. What appeared effortless was sustained through constant, silent effort, carried patiently upon the head. In the Gilded Age, a woman was assessed long before she was addressed. Her presence entered a room ahead of her voice, announcing itself through outline, posture, and restraint. The hat played a decisive role in this sequence, ensuring that judgment occurred in silence before any exchange could complicate it. Speech was secondary. To be heard required permission, and permission was granted only after appearance had been deemed acceptable. The hat functioned as the opening statement in a conversation that might never occur. It framed the face, moderated expression, and signaled whether engagement would proceed at all. This ordering was not accidental. Victorian society distrusted spontaneity, particularly in women. Words could reveal thought, emotion, or dissent. Appearance, by contrast, could be controlled, rehearsed, and corrected. By placing visual assessment first, society minimized uncertainty. The hat simplified the woman into a readable form before complexity could emerge. A woman entering a public space felt this immediately. Eyes moved before voices did. Appraisals happened in glances, brief but thorough. The hat's condition, angle, and appropriateness were registered instantly. From these details, assumptions followed. Education, temperament, morality, even health could be inferred without confirmation. If the hat satisfied expectation, conversation might begin politely. If it did not, speech became constrained, questions shortened, tones cooled. The woman's voice, when finally heard, arrived already weighted with preconception. She spoke not from neutrality, but from a position already defined. This was why the hat demanded such care. It was not merely clothing. It was a preemptive argument. It asserted respectability before it could be challenged. It softened the ground on which words would later fall. Without it, a woman's voice risked sounding defensive before it was even raised. The structure of the hat also disciplined expression. Brims. Limited upward glances. Decorations drew attention away from the mouth. Shadows softened emotion. Laughter could be partially hidden. Anger could be muted. The face became less legible, reducing the chance of misinterpretation. Silence, in this context, was safer than speech. Within domestic spaces, the rule relaxed slightly but did not disappear. Even among acquaintances, first impressions mattered. A woman who removed her hat too quickly risked appearing forward. One who kept it on too long seemed distant. The timing of removal was itself a form of speech, conveying comfort, familiarity, or reservation without words. This hierarchy, seen first, heard later, trained women to prioritize presentation over articulation. Many learned to speak less, trusting appearance to carry meaning instead. Others spoke carefully, aware that their words would be filtered through what had already been decided about them. The result was a culture in which female voices were often constrained not by explicit silencing, but by prejudgment. The hat contributed to this by ensuring that assessment preceded engagement. It offered protection by managing perception, but it also reinforced a system in which women were required to prove acceptability before participation. To be seen before heard was to exist conditionally. The hat made that condition manageable. It shaped the first encounter so that speech, when it finally arrived, would be tolerated rather than questioned. In a world that listened reluctantly, being seen correctly became a prerequisite for being heard at all. They were called fashionable, tasteful, even regal, yet they conferred no authority. The hats of the Gilded Age rose high, widened outward, shimmered with ornament, and borrowed the visual language of crowns without inheriting their force. They elevated the silhouette while anchoring the wearer firmly in place. A woman's hat could command attention without commanding obedience. This was its paradox. Height suggested importance. Rich materials implied status. Feathers arched like plumes of victory. And yet, beneath all this suggestion, the wearer remained subject, observed, interpreted, constrained. The crown was decorative, not declarative. This illusion served a purpose. Society was comfortable with women appearing powerful so long as that power remained symbolic. Visual prominence was permitted, social authority was not. The hat allowed women to occupy space without threatening hierarchy. It gave the appearance of elevation while ensuring immobility beneath it. The design itself reinforced this contradiction. Elaborate hats required balance, stillness, and awareness. Movement became deliberate, gestures slowed, sudden action risked collapse. A woman adorned in such a crown could not rush, could not argue forcefully, could not forget herself. The very object that made her visible also limited her capacity to act. These crowns without power also functioned as markers of containment. They framed the head, not to liberate thought, but to manage how thought appeared. Opinions could exist, but their expression was softened by lace, filtered through silk, and visually subordinated to ornament. The mind was present, but politely obscured. Men, meanwhile, wore hats that could be removed easily, tipped, set aside. Their headwear acknowledged authority and then stepped out of the way. A woman's hat did not offer such flexibility. It stayed, it endured, it demanded accommodation. It reminded the wearer constantly of her presentation. This imbalance was rarely discussed because it was rarely named. The hats were admired, complimented, desired. Their beauty distracted from their function. To question them would have appeared ungrateful, humorless, or unfeminine. After all, what could be oppressive about something so admired? Yet admiration carried its own weight. Compliments were not neutral. They reinforced the expectation that beauty was a woman's primary contribution. The crown existed to be noticed, not to authorize action. Attention replaced agency. Visibility substituted for voice. Women learned to navigate this contradiction intuitively. They mastered the art of presence without assertion. The hat allowed them to enter rooms grandly while remaining deferential. It signaled participation without challenge. One could be seen, praised, and yet remain unheard on matters that counted. Even within households of wealth, the pattern held. A woman might host beneath chandeliers, preside over gatherings, wear hats that rivaled royal regalia. Yet decisions moved around her, not through her. The crown adorned her role without altering its limits. These crowns without power were not accidental. They reflected a society comfortable with spectacle but uneasy with female authority. The hat became a compromise, elevation without elevation, dominance in form but not in effect. It satisfied the desire to see women beautifully contained. In this way, the Gilded Age perfected a visual language of restraint. The crown sat high, impressive, unquestioned, and beneath it, the woman learned to balance expectation, admiration, and limitation, wearing the appearance of power carefully without ever being allowed to claim it. The lesson began before it could be remembered. Long before a girl understood streets, judgment, or propriety, her head was already being prepared for weight. Small hats were placed gently at first, adjusted with smiles, secured with pins she was told not to touch. Stillness was praised, fidgeting corrected. In this way, training entered the body quietly, disguised as care. A girl learned early that the head was not entirely her own. It required supervision, arrangement, containment. Hair was brushed smooth and drawn back, not merely for neatness, but for order. Loose strands were corrected with impatience that felt out of proportion to the offense. Disorder at the crown suggested disorder beneath it. No one explained why this mattered. It was enough that it did. Adults moved with certainty, and children absorbed that certainty without question. A hat that slipped invited immediate attention. Fingers intervened. Posture was adjusted. The correction came swiftly, not cruelly, but insistently, as though something essential were at risk. This was how discipline entered daily life, not through instruction, but through repetition. A girl learned to sit carefully because sudden movement displaced what rested on her head. She learned to walk evenly because imbalance carried consequences. She learned to be aware of herself from above, imagining how she appeared before she felt how she moved. The hat became a teacher. It instructed through discomfort and reward. Proper behavior kept it steady. Improper behavior revealed itself immediately. The body responded by adapting. Muscles learned restraint. Movements softened. The self grew quieter. By adolescence, the habit no longer felt imposed. It felt natural. A young woman reached for her hat automatically, adjusting it without mirrors, sensing when it sat correctly. The training had become internal. The object no longer needed constant correction because the body had learned to anticipate its demands. This early conditioning shaped more than posture. It shaped expectation. A girl learned that attention followed appearance, and that appearance required effort. She learned that mistakes were visible, that correction was public, that compliance brought ease. These lessons extended far beyond millinery. Importantly, this training was framed as preparation, not restriction. Girls were told they were learning grace, refinement, womanhood. The weight on their heads was presented as rehearsal for adult elegance. Any discomfort was temporary, any resistance childish. Maturity meant endurance. The continuity between girlhood and womanhood was seamless. There was no moment of initiation, no clear transition. One simply wore larger hats, heavier ones, more complex ones. The expectations expanded, but the structure remained the same. What had once been guidance became obligation. Those who resisted stood out quickly. A girl who refused her hat appeared willful, uncooperative, difficult. Such labels followed her, quietly shaping how she was treated. Most learned to avoid this path. Compliance offered smoother passage. Thus, training from girlhood ensured the rule would never need to be enforced harshly in adulthood. The groundwork had already been laid. The habit had already taken root. A woman wore her hat not because she was told to, but because not wearing it felt wrong. By the time she stepped fully into public life, the lesson was complete. The head was prepared, the body disciplined, the expectation internalized. What had begun as instruction ended as instinct, and the hat rested where it always had, secure, unquestioned, and heavy with meaning learned long before it could be named. The milliner's shop was not merely a place of commerce. It was a quiet tribunal where taste, restraint, and social belonging were assessed without verdicts ever being spoken aloud. Within those softly lit rooms, lined with mirrors and padded counters, morality was shaped stitch by stitch. A woman did not enter such a shop casually. She arrived with awareness of her age, her status, her circumstances, and how closely she must align with expectation. The hats displayed were not neutral objects. Each carried an implication. Some suggested modesty, others hinted at indulgence. A few bordered on impropriety, though never enough to be condemned outright. The boundary between acceptable and excessive was thin, and the milliner stood as its custodian. Milliners understood their role instinctively. They advised with gentle authority, steering customers away from choices that might invite commentary. A brim too wide, a plume too tall, a color too vivid. These were corrected. Before purchase, framed as matters of balance or suitability. Rarely was the true concern named. Instead, moral alignment was disguised as aesthetic guidance. The language of the shop remained polite, technical, reassuring. Terms like becoming, refined, and appropriate did heavy work. They signaled approval or caution without accusation. A woman learned quickly which suggestions to heed. To insist otherwise was possible, but it marked her as someone willing to accept the consequences. This is where morality fused with craftsmanship. The hat became evidence of judgment exercised correctly. To wear one well chosen was to demonstrate awareness of one's place, one's limits, one's obligations. It said, without saying, that the wearer understood how to exist without disruption. Even maintenance carried moral weight. A hat kept clean and intact suggested diligence and respectability. One allowed to fray implied neglect, disorder, perhaps even moral laxity. Condition mattered as much as design. Carelessness at the crown reflected carelessness of character. Millinery also reinforced class distinctions, subtly but effectively. Wealth allowed access to variety, but not exemption. A wealthy woman was expected to demonstrate discernment, not excess. A working woman, by contrast, was expected to demonstrate effort, cleanliness, restraint, and careful repair. In both cases, the hat functioned as proof of moral participation. Importantly, the milliner did not create these standards. She enforced them. Her livelihood depended on alignment with prevailing expectations. To sell a woman a hat that brought her ridicule would have been professional failure. Thus, the shop became an extension of social order, translating unspoken rules into felt, wire, and ribbon. There was comfort in this arrangement. Many women trusted milliners precisely because they guarded the boundary. Choosing incorrectly alone was risky. Choosing under guidance felt safer. Responsibility was shared, and mistakes could be avoided before they became public. Yet this safety came at a cost. Individual expression narrowed. Creativity yielded to caution. The range of acceptable selves contracted until difference itself felt dangerous. Morality, once abstract, became wearable and visible. The hat left the shop not merely as an object, but as a moral instrument. It carried approval outward into the street. It reassured observers that the wearer had passed through the correct channels, accepted correction, and emerged properly formed. In this way, millinery did more than adorn. It quietly upheld a code. It shaped appearance into evidence of virtue and turned fashion into one of the most efficient moral regulators of the Gilded Age, soft-spoken, elegant, and relentlessly precise. There was a moment, subtle but decisive, when a woman's reflection ceased to feel provisional and became complete. It did not arrive with the fastening of a bodice or the smoothing of a skirt. It arrived when the hat was finally placed, adjusted, and secured. Only then did the image settle. Only then was she fully dressed. Until that point, everything else felt preparatory. Garments supported the body, shaped it, concealed it, but they did not authorize it. The hat performed that final act. It declared readiness, not for comfort, but for exposure. Without it, the body appeared unfinished, as though it were still in the private stages of becoming. This understanding was so ingrained that women spoke of it without analysis. One was not dressed yet until the hat was on, regardless of how carefully everything else had been arranged. The phrase carried weight. It suggested not just incompleteness, but impropriety. To step outside without the hat was to appear undressed in a way that defied explanation. The logic behind this rested on visibility. The head was the most immediately recognizable part of the body. Faces were known, remembered, judged. To leave the head, unframed, was to surrender too much of the self too quickly. The hat closed that vulnerability. It filtered recognition. It moderated identity. This is why even brief appearances required it. A quick errand, a short visit, a step onto the stoop. Duration did not matter. Exposure did. The hat was not about time spent in public, but about crossing into it at all. A woman might endure discomfort elsewhere, tight sleeves, heavy skirts, constricting shoes, but the absence of a hat caused a deeper unease. It felt like forgetting something essential, something that could not be improvised. Gloves might be borrowed, a shawl could be adjusted, a hat could not be replaced once the door was crossed. This sense of completion extended inward. Women reported feeling more composed once the hat was on. Shoulders settled, movement steadied. The body aligned itself to expectation. The hat imposed order not just visually, but psychologically. It reminded the wearer of how she must move, speak, and be seen. In social contexts, this completeness mattered intensely. A woman arriving without her hat was not merely underdressed, she was improperly introduced. Others did not know how to place her. Conversation faltered, politeness strained, the omission disrupted the script. The hat also signaled readiness to endure scrutiny. It said, "I am prepared to be seen." Without it, a woman appeared caught off guard, unarmored. That vulnerability was unsettling, not only to herself, but to those who observed her. The system depended on predictability, and predictability depended on ritual. Even at day's end, removal was careful. The hat did not come off immediately upon returning indoors. It lingered, marking the gradual transition from public to private. To remove it was to relax, to shed vigilance, to re-enter a space where one could exist without constant calibration. Thus, a woman fully dressed was not merely clothed, she was contained, authorized, and prepared. The hat completed her not because it adorned her, but because it allowed her to enter the world on its terms, protected, disciplined, and legible. Without it, something essential was missing. With it, she became what society required her to be, finished, presentable, and ready to endure being seen. There was a moment of danger, not only in appearing without a hat, but in removing it before the proper hour. The act itself was small, fingers loosening pins, a lift at the crown, a careful lowering. But its timing carried consequence. In the Gilded Age, when a woman removed her hat mattered as much as when she wore it. The threshold between public and private was not defined by walls alone. It was governed by custom, observation, and unspoken permission. A hat remained in place until safety could be assumed. To remove it too soon was to misjudge the space, to reveal comfort where vigilance was still required. In parlors, visiting rooms, and semi-public interiors, the hat lingered. Its presence signaled restraint, distance, formality. Only when conversation softened, when social footing was secure, when the environment proved itself predictable, could the hat be set aside. Even then, removal was deliberate, never casual. A woman did not discard her defenses abruptly. Removing it too soon suggested intimacy not yet granted. It implied familiarity that had not been earned. Observers might not comment, but they noticed. A woman who uncovered herself prematurely appeared either naive or presumptuous. Both interpretations carried risk. This was especially true in mixed company. Men read removal differently than women did. What felt like comfort to the wearer could be interpreted as invitation by others. The hat had moderated interpretation. Without it, the face was suddenly open, expressive, readable. The barrier was gone. Women learned this through experience rather than instruction. A poorly timed removal might be followed by a shift in tone, a lingering glance, a subtle change in how one was addressed. Nothing overt occurred, yet the atmosphere altered. The lesson was absorbed quickly. Thus, the hat became a gauge. Its presence measured the safety of a space. Its removal confirmed trust. To misread the moment was to expose oneself unnecessarily. Over time, women developed acute sensitivity to these transitions, sensing when it was appropriate to remain guarded and when it was permissible to relax. Even among familiar acquaintances, caution persisted. A gathering might include known faces, but the environment itself still demanded formality. Servants moved quietly. Doors opened and closed. Social roles remained active. The hat stayed on until the setting fully surrendered its public character. The consequences of removing it too soon were rarely dramatic, but they were cumulative. A woman known for such missteps acquired a reputation, not scandalous, but careless. That reputation followed her. Invitations became conditional. Trust thinned. Correction arrived quietly. The hat, then, was not merely worn or removed. It was managed. Its presence calibrated exposure. Its absence required certainty. To err on the side of caution was encouraged. Better to endure discomfort than to miscalculate. At the end of the evening, when the hat was finally removed without consequence, relief followed. The head lightened. The body softened. Vigilance eased. The transition marked a return to safety, to selfhood less constrained. Removing it too soon denied this progression. It collapsed stages that were meant to unfold gradually. The social order depended on pacing, and the hat enforced it. In this way, the hat governed not just where a woman could go, but when she could let herself be seen without defense. Timing, like everything else, was learned through restraint. The street did not look away. It never had. In the Gilded Age, public space was saturated with observation, a continuous low-level scrutiny that settled on women the moment they crossed the threshold. The public stare was not always hostile, nor always conscious, but it was constant. It moved through crowds quietly, collecting impressions, sorting bodies into categories, assigning meaning without invitation. A woman felt it immediately. The air outside carried weight. Eyes followed without seeming to. Reflections multiplied her presence in windows and polished brass. Even when no one appeared to be watching, she knew she was being seen. The hat existed for this moment. Without it, the stare landed too directly. Faces were exposed to full recognition. Expressions were readable. The woman herself became legible in ways that were dangerous. The hat intervened, altering how the stare made contact. It broke lines of sight. It softened angles. It gave the gaze something else to occupy. The public stare did not ask permission. It did not announce itself. It assessed quickly and moved on, leaving behind a residue of judgment that could not be contested. A woman could not correct it once it had formed. She could only anticipate it. This anticipation shaped behavior profoundly. Posture straightened, movement slowed. The body learned to present itself carefully, not to invite attention, but to manage it. The hat assisted by absorbing excess scrutiny. Its details, feathers, ribbon, structure, drew the eye upward and outward, away from expression and emotion. Importantly, the stare did not distinguish between admiration and threat. Both were equally invasive. To be admired too freely was to risk misinterpretation. To be scrutinized harshly was to risk dismissal. The ideal was to be seen correctly and briefly. The hat helped achieve this balance. Different spaces intensified the stare in different ways. Busy streets produced diffuse observation. Many eyes, none singular. Quieter areas sharpened attention. A lone woman without proper covering drew immediate notice. The absence of a hat amplified visibility, marking her as irregular. The stare also functioned as enforcement. No words were necessary. A lingering glance, a raised eyebrow, a pause, these were sufficient. Women adjusted instinctively, responding to signals too subtle to name. The hat provided insulation, reducing the intensity of these exchanges. Over time, the public stare became internalized. Women learned to see themselves as they were seen. Mirrors were no longer required. One could feel misalignment, sense when something was wrong, detect vulnerability before it was exploited. The hat reassured by restoring order to that imagined reflection. This internalization was not weakness, it was adaptation. The public stare could not be eliminated, so it was negotiated. The hat became a tool in that negotiation, allowing women to pass through public space with reduced friction. To remove the hat, or to wear it improperly, was to invite the stare in full force. It was to accept scrutiny without mediation. Few chose this willingly. Thus, the public stare remained omnipresent, shaping movement, behavior, and self-perception. And the hat remained where it always had, between the woman and the watching world, absorbing judgment quietly, allowing her to exist without being fully consumed by the act of being seen. The brim was never accidental. Its curve, its width, its angle were calculated with care, refined over years of collective observation. In the Gilded Age, the brim performed delicate work. It reshaped how a woman's face entered the world, softening what might otherwise appear too direct, too readable, too exposed. Light behaved differently beneath a brim. It broke before reaching the eyes, diffused across skin, settled into shadow where expression might have been too clear. Foreheads disappeared partially, lending anonymity. Cheekbones lost sharpness. The face emerged not fully, but selectively, as though offered under careful terms. This mattered deeply in a culture that equated legibility with vulnerability. A face too clearly seen could be remembered, interpreted, misread. The brim interfered with that process. It delayed recognition. It allowed a woman to look outward while limiting how much of herself was returned. Milliners understood this instinctively. They adjusted brims with practiced hands, tilting them minutely until the effect felt correct. Too low, and the woman appeared secretive or severe. Too high, and the face opened too fully, inviting attention. The ideal rested in between, where expression could be controlled without seeming withheld. Women learned to sense this balance. They tilted their heads slightly when passing through bright streets. They adjusted posture to maintain the shadow just so. The brim taught the body how to cooperate with concealment. It rewarded restraint. This softening extended beyond appearance into interaction. Conversations unfolded differently when faces were partially veiled. Directness eased, tension diminished. The brim allowed women to maintain composure without constant performance. Emotion could exist without immediate display. The effect was subtle but cumulative. Over time, brims shaped how women were perceived. Less confrontational, less demanding, less defined. These qualities were praised as gentleness or refinement, though they were often the result of careful visual management rather than temperament. The brim also offered plausible deniability. If a glance lingered too long, it could be blamed on shadow. If emotion flickered across the eyes, it might go unnoticed. The woman retained control over how much of herself was available for interpretation. In crowded spaces, this mattered intensely. The brim created a private zone within public proximity. It narrowed the field of vision without signaling withdrawal. One could remain present while slightly removed. Even photographs of the era reveal this function. Faces beneath brims appear softened, distant, composed. The camera, like the street, was mediated through millinery. The record itself was filtered. Thus, the brim did more than decorate. It negotiated visibility. It transformed the face into something less immediate, less vulnerable, more manageable. In a world that demanded constant appraisal, the softened face was a form of quiet resistance, polite, elegant, and deeply intentional. Recognition was not neutral. In the Gilded Age, to be recognized was to be fixed in memory, assigned a place, attached to a narrative not of one's choosing. The danger was not being seen, but being known too clearly, too quickly, by the wrong eyes. The hat existed, in part, to interfere with that process. Recognition depended on access to the face. The hat complicated that access. Its brim altered outlines, its height changed proportions, hairlines shifted, familiar features became uncertain. A woman could pass through a space she had visited before without being fully reclaimed by it. She might be seen, but not immediately named. This mattered more than politeness allowed anyone to admit. Cities were networks of memory. Shopkeepers remembered faces, neighbors cataloged appearances. Rumor traveled faster than confirmation. To be recognized repeatedly was to accumulate identity in ways that could not be controlled. The hat disrupted that accumulation. A woman might wish to move through the city without leaving a trail. The hat allowed this modest anonymity. It made recognition conditional rather than automatic. One could be present without being fully accounted for. In a society that prized order, this small freedom mattered. Protection from recognition also guarded against familiarity. Familiarity was not always welcome. It invited questions, expectations, claims. A woman who was too easily recognized risked being approached without consent, spoken to without invitation, assessed as accessible. The hat complicated approach. It signaled boundary. This was especially important for women who moved between different social spheres. A hat appropriate to one setting could obscure recognition in another. Adjustments in style, color, or angle allowed controlled passage. Identity became situational rather than fixed. The protection extended inward as well. Being constantly recognized imposed a performance burden. One had to maintain continuity, uphold impressions, remember previous interactions. The hat eased this by allowing partial withdrawal. It granted the wearer permission to exist without constant recall. Importantly, this protection was subtle. It did not erase identity, it blurred it. The woman remained visible enough to be polite, distant enough to be safe. The balance was delicate and required constant calibration. Those who failed to manage this balance paid quietly. A woman too recognizable became an object of familiarity she had not authorized. Her movements were tracked, her habits noted, her reputation hardened. The hat, properly worn, delayed this hardening. Thus, protection from recognition was not concealment, but control. It allowed a woman to decide when she would be fully known and when she would remain provisional. In a culture that remembered eagerly and forgave slowly, this control was essential. The hat offered no guarantees, only advantage. It bought time. It introduced uncertainty. It softened the certainty with which others claimed knowledge. And in that uncertainty, a woman found space to move, to choose, to remain partially her own. There was a difference, carefully understood and rarely articulated, between being seen and being looked at correctly. In the Gilded Age, this distinction shaped every step a woman took beyond her doorway. To be looked at incorrectly was not merely uncomfortable, it was dangerous, reputationally and socially. The hat existed to guide the gaze, to instruct it without confrontation. Being looked at correctly meant being acknowledged without invitation. It meant the gaze rested briefly, registered respectability, and moved on. It did not linger. It did not search. It did not interpret beyond what was offered. This form of looking affirmed order. Anything else unsettled it. Women learned early that they could not control whether they were looked at, but they could influence how. The hat became the primary instrument of that influence. Its brim determined where the gaze landed. Its ornament redirected attention. Its presence established context before interpretation began. A woman without a hat invited misalignment. The gaze dropped too low. It lingered too long. It searched for meaning that should not have been requested. What might have been a neutral glance became evaluative, speculative. The absence of proper framing made the face feel available in ways that could not be undone. Correct looking preserved dignity on both sides. It allowed men to look without appearing intrusive and women to be seen without appearing exposed. The hat facilitated this, mutual restraint. It created a shared understanding. What was visible was intentional. What was concealed was not up for inquiry. This balance was especially fragile in transitional spaces, doorways, platforms, corridors, where public and private overlapped. The hat stabilized these moments. It prevented the gaze from misreading uncertainty as openness. It maintained continuity as environments shifted. Being looked at correctly also meant being categorized accurately. The hat communicated class, intention, and propriety before conversation began. This reduced friction. Misclassification invited correction, and correction carried humiliation. A well-chosen hat minimized that risk. Women who mastered this visual negotiation moved through society with fewer disruptions. They were neither ignored nor pursued. Their presence was accepted as appropriate, their boundaries respected without explanation. This was not privilege. It was successful navigation. Those who failed were not punished overtly. They were subjected to correction through attention, too much, too little, or wrongly focused. The experience taught quickly. Adjustment followed. Thus, being looked at correctly was not vanity. It was strategy. The hat ensured the gaze behaved. It transformed observation into acknowledgement, scrutiny into civility. In a world that watched relentlessly, guiding how one was seen became an essential skill, learned patiently and worn carefully upon the head. Shade was never merely an absence of light. In the Gilded Age, it was a condition deliberately cultivated, a quiet refuge shaped by felt and brim. Beneath a hat's shadow, a woman gained something rare in public space: margin. The shade did not hide her, but it softened the world's reach, blunting the sharp edges of attention. Sunlight was indiscriminate. It revealed too much, too quickly. It sharpened features, exaggerated expressions, fixed faces into memory. Shade intervened in this process. It allowed the face to exist in partial disclosure, offering presence without surrender. The hat's brim became a moving shelter, carried from street to doorway, from carriage to shop, wherever exposure followed. This shelter mattered because safety was never guaranteed. The street was unpredictable, crowded with intention and interpretation. Shade provided a buffer against both. It dulled recognition, discouraged prolonged inspection, and allowed a woman to pass without becoming a spectacle. In shadow, she was less legible and therefore less claimable. Women learned to value this instinctively. They adjusted their hats not for vanity, but for coverage. A fraction lower in bright streets, tilted just enough to catch the afternoon glare. The body learned to cooperate with the shadow, angling itself so that light struck fabric before skin. This choreography was practiced, precise, and largely unconscious. Shade also moderated emotion. Faces exposed to full light were expected to perform. Pleasantness, composure, interest. Under a brim, the demand softened. The eyes could rest, the mouth could relax. Small failures of expression passed unnoticed. Shade allowed a woman to be human without immediate consequence. There was a psychological safety in this as well. The shadow created a boundary between the inner self and the public world. Thoughts could remain unexpressed. Reactions could be delayed. The constant pressure to present diminished slightly. In a society that prized self-command, this small reprieve was invaluable. Importantly, shade was socially acceptable protection. It required no justification. A woman did not have to explain her desire for cover. The hat provided it automatically, elegantly, without protest. Safety arrived disguised as fashion, and so it could be used freely. Those who dismissed shade underestimated its role. To walk bareheaded in full light was to accept a level of exposure few could sustain. Faces burned, eyes squinted, tempers shortened. The absence of shade heightened vulnerability. Even confidence faltered beneath constant illumination. Shade also equalized interactions. In shadow, social hierarchies softened. The precise reading of features, age, fatigue, worry, became harder. A woman could appear composed even when she was not. This control over perception restored a measure of dignity. Thus, shade became safety not because it concealed wrongdoing, but because it reduced demand. It allowed a woman to exist in public without constant interrogation by light and gaze. The hat's shadow traveled with her, offering a quiet, portable refuge. In this way, shade did its work silently. It did not announce itself as protection. It simply made the world less aggressive, less invasive, more survivable, one softened face at a time. Distance in the Gilded Age was not always measured in steps. Often, it was fashioned, stitched, angled, and worn deliberately. A woman could stand close and yet remain unreachable. The hat made this possible. It created separation without withdrawal, distance without refusal. Public life required proximity. Streets pressed bodies together. Carriages confined strangers to shared air. Shops narrowed movement into aisles and counters. A woman could not avoid closeness, but she could regulate intimacy. The hat performed this regulation quietly, interposing formality where bodies were forced near. Its height altered eye lines. Conversations occurred at angles rather than directly face-to-face. The brim interrupted straight approaches, discouraging familiarity without offense. One could be present, attentive, even polite, while remaining slightly apart. The distance was visible but unspoken. This mattered because directness carried implication. A face fully open, unobstructed, invited engagement that might not be welcome. The hat signaled reserve. It announced that interaction would proceed on defined terms, not improvised ones. The boundary was clear enough to be respected, subtle enough to avoid confrontation. Fashion distance also protected against assumption. Without it, proximity might be mistaken for availability. The hat clarified intent before misunderstanding could form. It allowed a woman to occupy space without surrendering it. Women became adept at using this tool. They angled themselves strategically in conversation, letting the brim do its work. A slight turn of the head reinforced distance. A maintained posture kept interaction formal. These gestures were small, but they accumulated effect. The success of fashion distance depended on its acceptability. Because it was aesthetic, it was not challenged. One could not accuse a woman of rudeness for wearing what was expected of her. The boundary held because it was normalized. This distance extended into social hierarchies. A woman of status could maintain separation without appearing cold. A woman of lesser standing could claim dignity without appearing presumptuous. The hat equalized interaction by providing a shared visual grammar of restraint. Importantly, fashion distance preserved energy. Constant closeness exhausted. Constant explanation wore thin. The hat reduced both demands. It allowed a woman to move through public life with fewer negotiations, fewer corrections, fewer defenses raised. Without it, distance had to be asserted verbally or behaviorally, risking offense. With it, distance simply existed, assumed and respected. The hat did not push others away. It held them at the proper remove. Thus, fashion distance was not withdrawal from society. It was participation on safer terms. The hat made this possible, turning fashion into a quiet architecture of space, one that followed a woman wherever she went, keeping the world close enough to navigate, but never close enough to overwhelm. Crowded rooms demanded discipline of a particular kind. In the Gilded Age, gatherings compressed bodies into proximity while insisting upon composure. Parlors filled with overlapping conversations, shoulders brushed, heat accumulated beneath gaslight, and yet expression was expected to remain measured. The hat became essential here, not for separation of space, but for containment of the self. Indoors, the threat was not exposure to strangers alone, but exposure to too many known faces at once. Each carried expectation, each remembered, each watched for deviation. In such rooms, a woman's face risked becoming overlegible, revealing fatigue, irritation, or uncertainty she could not afford to display. The hat intervened by moderating presence. Its brim shaped how the face entered shared vision. Expressions were softened before they could be read too sharply. The upper face, often the most revealing, fell into partial shadow. A woman could listen without broadcasting reaction, smile without committing to warmth, remain composed even when pressed by noise and closeness. This mattered, particularly in social gatherings where observation functioned as currency. Who spoke to whom, how long one lingered, where one stood, all were noticed. The face, if too open, betrayed alliances and aversions. The hat allowed a woman to remain socially legible without being emotionally transparent. Movement in crowded rooms was constrained, and the hat reinforced this. One learned to turn carefully, to navigate without sudden shifts. The body adapted, becoming economical. Each gesture was restrained, deliberate. The hat demanded this economy, punishing excess with imbalance. In return, it rewarded calm. There was also protection in uniformity. In rooms where many women wore hats, the collective effect blurred individuality. Faces became variations within a pattern rather than singular points of focus. Attention diffused. The hat allowed a woman to belong without being singled out. Removing the hat indoors was not immediate. It depended on context, invitation, and the perceived safety of the space. In formal gatherings, hats remained. In more intimate settings, they were removed gradually, once conversation settled and observation softened. Timing was critical. To remove too soon risked vulnerability. To keep it on too long risked aloofness. Women learned to read rooms quickly. They sensed when scrutiny eased, when faces relaxed, when the collective gaze loosened its grip. Only then did the hat come off, and even then, removal was careful. The object was set aside respectfully, never discarded. Its presence lingered psychologically, even when it no longer rested on the head. In crowded rooms, the hat was less about being seen correctly than about not being seen too much. It dampened intensity. It filtered sensation. It allowed women to endure social compression without emotional spillage. Thus, controlled faces were not a sign of indifference, but of survival. The hat helped maintain that control, shaping interaction in spaces where too much visibility could overwhelm. In rooms full of eyes, it kept the self intact, composed, and quietly defended. Movement introduced its own vulnerabilities. A woman in transit was neither fully public nor fully private, suspended between destinations, enclosed with strangers, observed without the protections of familiarity. Carriages and trains compressed this uncertainty into narrow spaces where distance could not be fashioned by steps alone. Here, the hat took on a new function, not as display, but as stabilizer. In carriages, bodies faced one another at close range, knees aligned, breath mingled. Conversation, if it occurred, was unavoidable. The hat intervened by reorganizing proximity. Its height altered sightlines. Its brim redirected glances downward or aside. One could occupy the same bench without being visually entangled. The face remained present, but not intrusive. The carriage was a peculiar environment. It permitted closeness without consent and demanded restraint. Without relief, the hat provided a steadying presence amid motion. As wheels turned and streets passed, the hat anchored the wearer, reminding her to remain composed even as the world shifted. Sudden jolts tested balance. The body responded by tightening control. Stillness became a necessity rather than a preference. Trains intensified these demands. Compartments enclosed strangers together for extended periods. There was no polite escape, no shifting position without consequence. In such spaces, exposure multiplied. Without the hat, a woman's face would be fully available for the duration of the journey, subject to prolonged observation. The hat interrupted this availability, creating intervals of privacy within forced proximity. Women learned to sit in ways that preserved the brim's function, heads angled slightly, eyes lowered to reading or window views. The hat allowed withdrawal without rudeness. It signaled that engagement was not required simply because space was shared. There was also the matter of recognition. Travel increased the chance of encountering acquaintances unexpectedly. The hat provided continuity across contexts, ensuring that a woman appeared as she wished to be recognized, not caught mid-transition. It preserved dignity during movement when composure was otherwise difficult to maintain. Even practical considerations reinforced the hat's role. Dust from streets, soot from engines, and wind through open windows threatened appearance. The hat shielded hair and face, preventing disorder that could not be corrected mid-journey. Cleanliness, closely tied to respectability, was preserved beneath felt and ribbon. Removal during transit was rare. The space was not safe enough, the boundaries too porous. Only upon arrival, when the destination asserted its character, did removal become possible. Until then, the hat stayed in place, maintaining readiness. In this way, hats in carriages and trains did not merely accompany travel, they managed it. They mediated between motion and stillness, proximity and reserve, exposure and control. They allowed women to endure the unsettled nature of transit without surrendering the carefully maintained equilibrium of their public selves. Movement without protection invited misreading. With the hat, a woman remained composed even while in motion, contained, prepared, and intact as the world passed by. The gaze did not arrive empty. It carried expectation, habit, and entitlement, shaped long before any particular woman crossed its path. In the Gilded Age, the male gaze was neither singular nor uniform, but it was persistent, trained to assess, to measure, to linger. The hat did not confront this gaze. It redirected it. Direct opposition would have been impolite, even dangerous. Women were not encouraged to refuse attention outright. Instead, they learned to manage it. The hat offered a means of redirection that preserved civility while reclaiming control. Its ornament, height, and complexity gave the gaze something to occupy that was not the face itself. Feathers drew the eye upward, ribbons carried attention outward, texture invited inspection without intimacy. The gaze, diverted, became aesthetic rather than evaluative. It lingered on design, not expression. The woman remained present, but her interiority stayed protected. This redirection was crucial because the gaze rarely announced its intentions. What began as observation could become interpretation. Interpretation could harden into assumption. The hat interrupted this progression early. It kept attention at the surface, preventing it from descending into familiarity. Women understood this instinctively. They selected hats not merely for beauty, but for balance. Too plain, and the gaze dropped too easily to the face. Too elaborate, and it invited scrutiny of excess. The correct hat held attention at a safe distance, engaging without inviting. The male gaze, when redirected, successfully behaved differently. It became polite, appreciative rather than possessive, brief rather than lingering. This shift mattered. It preserved dignity without requiring explanation. The woman did not have to signal discomfort or disapproval. The hat had already done that work. Importantly, redirection did not mean invisibility. Women were still seen, still admired, still acknowledged. But the terms of that attention changed. The gaze followed paths laid out for it, guided by design rather than impulse. This guidance allowed women to exist publicly without becoming targets of interpretation they had not consented to. There was also safety in this arrangement. A gaze that lingered on ornament was less likely to linger on the body. The hat created visual complexity that discouraged fixation. Attention moved, flowed, dispersed. The woman remained intact within it. This redirection required maintenance. A hat worn carelessly lost its effectiveness. If it tilted incorrectly, if ornament sagged, the gaze slipped past the barrier. Women adjusted constantly, ensuring that the redirective function remained intact. This vigilance was tiring, but necessary. Men, for their part, often remained unaware of the negotiation taking place. They saw fashion, not strategy, beauty, not defense. This ignorance allowed the system to persist. The hat did not challenge the gaze. It satisfied it just enough to render it manageable. Thus, the male gaze was not eliminated. It was reshaped, redirected toward safe channels, rendered less invasive by design. The hat achieved this quietly, elegantly, without confrontation. In a society that expected women to endure attention gracefully, the ability to redirect it was essential. The hat provided that ability, turning observation into ornament, scrutiny into style, and allowing women to move through watch spaces with a measure of control that would otherwise have been denied them. To be half seen was not to be diminished. In the Gilded Age, it was often the safest state a woman could occupy in public. Complete visibility invited interpretation, assumption, and claim. Complete invisibility invited dismissal. Between these extremes lay a narrow, carefully maintained position, present yet withheld. The hat made this possible. A woman half seen moved through the world with intention. Her outline was legible, her presence acknowledged, but her full self remained unrevealed. The hat controlled this balance. Its brim obscured portions of the face, its structure altered recognition, its height shifted focus. Observers saw enough to place her, but not enough to possess her. This partial visibility was not accidental. It was cultivated through habit, posture, and constant adjustment. Women learned how to offer just enough of themselves to satisfy social requirement without surrendering interiority. The hat enforced this discipline gently but persistently. In public encounters, half seen meant protected from excessive curiosity. Eyes might pass over her, register respectability, and move on. The woman did not invite further inquiry. She existed within the acceptable margins of notice. This was not anonymity, but controlled acknowledgement. The half-seen state also allowed women to observe freely. From beneath the brim, they could watch without being watched in return. Expressions could remain private, reactions could be measured. The hat created a one-way permeability. Vision outward, opacity inward. This advantage was subtle, but powerful. Social life rewarded this restraint. A woman who revealed too much of herself too quickly risked misinterpretation. A woman who revealed too little risked being overlooked. The hat calibrated this exposure precisely. It maintained balance where missteps were costly. Even emotionally, half seen offered relief. The constant demand to perform softened. One could exist without continual display of pleasantness or composure, fatigue, irritation, or distraction could pass unnoticed beneath shadow and structure. The self remained intact. Importantly, half-seen did not imply weakness, it implied mastery of social navigation. Women who achieved this balance moved through spaces with fewer disruptions, fewer corrections, fewer intrusions. Their presence was accepted as proper without being interrogated. This state was learned gradually. Early misjudgments taught caution. Overexposure brought consequence. Withdrawal brought isolation. The hat, properly worn, guided women toward the middle ground where survival was possible. Thus, a woman half-seen was not incomplete. She was protected. The hat allowed her to exist within sight without being consumed by it, to participate without surrender, to move through a world that watched relentlessly while keeping part of herself safely her own. In that half-light beneath the brim, women found room to breathe, visible enough to belong, concealed enough to endure. Body, in the Gilded Age, was believed to be permeable, not merely vulnerable, but porous, open to invasion by weather, air, and unseen forces that moved without warning. Illness was thought to enter quietly, slipping through exposed skin, settling into tissues, altering temperament before announcing itself. The head, in particular, was regarded as dangerously receptive. To leave it uncovered was to invite intrusion. Cold was feared not simply for its chill, but for its persistence. A draft at the crown could linger, believed to settle into nerves and bones, producing weakness that medicine could neither locate nor fully cure. Women were warned, by doctors, by mothers, by neighbors, that an uncovered head invited long suffering. Headaches, faintness, melancholy, and nervous disorders were all traced back, in popular imagination, to improper exposure. Sun carried its own dangers. Light, too direct, was thought to exhaust the mind, overstimulate the senses, and weaken constitution. A woman exposed to sun risked more than discomfort. She risked discoloration of skin, certainly, but also imbalance. Too much heat at the head, too much agitation of thought. Shade was prescribed not as comfort, but as necessity. Then there were vapors. The air itself was suspect. Streets carried soot, dampness, industrial residue, and unnamed miasmas believed to drift invisibly through cities. Vapors rose from drains, alleyways, and even bodies. To inhale them too freely was to court illness. The hat, thick with felt and lined with fabric, acted as a filter of sorts, symbolic if not literal, interposing material between woman and atmosphere. Medical language reinforced these fears. Physicians spoke of delicate nerves, sensitive constitutions, and female susceptibility. The head was presented as a site requiring protection, insulation, moderation. Hats were recommended not merely as fashion, but as healthful practice. A woman who fell ill might be questioned about exposure. Had she gone out bareheaded? Had she stood in wind or sun? The implication was clear. Women absorbed these warnings readily because they aligned with lived experience. Fatigue followed exposure. Dizziness accompanied heat. Cold wind sharpened pain. The hat offered reassurance. It promised containment, stability, and protection against forces too vague to combat directly. Importantly, these beliefs blurred the boundary between medicine and morality. A woman who protected herself properly demonstrated prudence. One who did not invited blame. Illness became not just misfortune, but evidence of carelessness. The hat thus served both health and respectability, reinforcing each other. Even indoors, concerns persisted. Drafts through corridors, unheated rooms, and fluctuating temperatures were thought dangerous. Hats lingered longer than comfort required, guarding against invisible threats. The line between sensible precaution and enforced habit dissolved. Whether or not the dangers were real mattered less than the certainty with which they were believed. The hat became a response to an environment perceived as hostile, unpredictable, and penetrative. It sealed the head against intrusion, offering a sense of control over a body believed constantly at risk. Thus, cold, sun, and vapors justified what etiquette demanded. Health provided reason where custom enforced habit. The hat stood at the intersection of fear and fashion, protecting not just appearance, but the imagined boundaries of the self in a world thought full of unseen harm. Hair was never regarded as neutral. In the Gilded Age, it was treated as both ornament and liability, beautiful when controlled, dangerous when free. It framed the face, signaled youth or decline, and carried implications that reached far beyond appearance. To leave it exposed was to risk more than disorder. It was to reveal vulnerability. Loose hair suggested a lack of restraint. It implied intimacy, emotion, or carelessness, depending on context. In private, loosened hair belonged to rest, illness, or closeness. In public, it unsettled. It disrupted the careful separation between what was permitted to be seen and what was meant to remain concealed. The hat existed to enforce this boundary. Hair, when uncovered, moved. Wind lifted it. Humidity altered it. Light caught it unpredictably. This movement drew attention downward, toward the face and neck, areas already heavily scrutinized. The hat immobilized hair, pinning it into obedience, ensuring that nothing escaped the intended outline. There were also medical anxieties bound tightly to hair. It was believed to trap heat, absorb vapors, and transmit illness if improperly managed. Damp hair was especially feared. A woman with exposed hair risked chills, headaches, and nervous disturbance. Covering the head was seen as preventative care, an act of prudence rather than vanity. The vulnerability was not only physical, hair was deeply symbolic. Its arrangement communicated discipline, maturity, and moral order. A woman whose hair escaped its pins suggested emotional instability or moral looseness, even if the escape was accidental. The hat concealed these risks, preserving the illusion of control. Women became acutely aware of this. They learned to feel when a pin shifted, when a strand loosened. Anxiety followed such sensations until correction was possible. The hat provided reassurance, holding everything in place even when vigilance faltered. Class expectations sharpened these concerns. A working woman with uncontained hair appeared careless. A wealthy woman appeared indulgent. In either case, exposure invited commentary. The hat equalized appearance, enforcing uniform restraint across differences. Even age played a role. Youthful hair was expected to be controlled early, signaling readiness for propriety. Aging hair was concealed to avoid acknowledgement of decline. The hat mediated both, smoothing transitions that society preferred not to confront directly. Thus, hair became something to manage, not celebrate openly. Its beauty was permitted only within structure. The hat provided that structure reliably, without requiring constant attention. In this way, hair was understood as vulnerability, not because it was weak, but because it was expressive. The hat silenced that expression, rendering it safe for public view. Beneath felt and ribbon, hair ceased to speak, and in that silence, a woman found protection. The air itself was never trusted. In the Gilded Age, cities breathed heavily, exhaling soot, ash, horsehair, refuse, and the residue of industry into every street and corridor. Dust was not merely inconvenience. It was suspected carrier, invisible courier of illness and moral decline alike. To walk bareheaded through it was considered reckless. Women were taught to regard the atmosphere as an active presence, capable of entering the body and altering it. Dust settled into hair, clung to skin, and was believed to penetrate inward, disturbing nerves and weakening constitution. The hat stood as first defense, intercepting contamination before it reached more vulnerable parts. Medical thinking reinforced this fear. Disease was often explained not through precise mechanisms, but through exposure. Miasmas, particles, and impurities floated unseen, attaching themselves to those insufficiently protected. The head, warm and receptive, was thought especially vulnerable. Covering it was not superstition, but sensible hygiene according to the standards of the time. Decorum aligned neatly with this belief. Cleanliness was moralized. A woman who allowed dust to settle upon her hair appeared negligent, careless with both health and appearance. The hat preserved order by maintaining cleanliness longer than the body alone could manage. It kept the visible self intact, even as the environment degraded it. This mattered in public settings where impressions formed quickly. Dust-marked hair suggested disorder. Disorder invited judgment. The hat prevented such associations, ensuring that environmental grime did not become personal indictment. Even brief exposure was discouraged. A woman might cross a street quickly, but the dust lingered longer than the step. The hat extended protection beyond duration, guarding against accumulation. It absorbed what the body should not. Urban expansion intensified these concerns. Construction sites, factories, and increased traffic filled the air with debris. Hats became thicker, more structured, more deliberately enclosing. Fashion adapted to hazard without naming it as such. In this way, decorum and disease prevention merged. To dress properly was to protect oneself. To protect oneself was to behave properly. The hat embodied this union, quietly transforming fear into formality. Thus, dust and disease reinforced custom. The hat remained not just a social requirement, but a barrier against a world perceived as constantly encroaching. Cleanliness, health, and propriety were all preserved beneath its brim, allowing a woman to move through an increasingly polluted environment without appearing touched by it at all. The skull was spoken of with caution. In the Gilded Age, it was treated not as a sturdy enclosure, but as a delicate threshold, thin, impressionable, and easily disturbed. Medical texts, popular advice columns, and household wisdom converged on the same conclusion. A woman's head required protection not because it was strong, but because it was believed to be inherently fragile. Physicians warned of shocks to the system that entered through the crown. Sudden cold, excess heat, sharp sound, emotional agitation, these were said to travel downward, unsettling nerves and weakening the mind. The female skull, described endlessly as sensitive, was thought particularly susceptible. Its contents, thought, temperament, balance, were imagined as easily displaced. This fragility was not limited to physical injury. It extended to mental and emotional stability. Women were described as prone to nervous conditions, faintness, hysteria, and exhaustion, all of which were loosely connected to disturbances of the head. The solution offered was not empowerment, but insulation. Protect the skull, and the woman might remain composed. The hat served this purpose perfectly. It rested atop the head like a buffer, absorbing impact from wind, noise, and change in temperature. It was said to keep the mind calm by keeping the head regulated. Even pressure was considered beneficial, steady, constant, reassuring. The weight of the hat was interpreted as grounding rather than restrictive. Women internalized these warnings early. A chill at the head became a cause for concern. A headache following exposure was taken as confirmation. The logic reinforced itself. The hat was worn not just out of habit, but out of precaution. To remove it was to risk imbalance. Importantly, this narrative of fragility justified broader control. If the skull was delicate, then protection was necessary. If protection was necessary, then regulation followed naturally. The hat became an outward sign of inward vulnerability, reinforcing the idea that women required constant management for their own well-being. Even strength was reframed through this lens. A woman who endured discomfort beneath a heavy hat was praised for fortitude, not questioned for compliance. Endurance became evidence of character. The fragility of the skull did not excuse weakness, it demanded discipline. The medical language of the time blurred easily into moral expectation. A woman who ignored advice, who went bareheaded, was seen as irresponsible, not just risking health but rejecting wisdom. Illness that followed was framed as consequence, not misfortune. Thus, the fragile female skull became both explanation and excuse. It explained why women needed protection and excused why that protection took the form of restriction. The hat embodied this logic elegantly, sitting quietly atop the head as proof that care was being taken. Whether the skull was truly fragile mattered less than the certainty with which it was believed. The belief shaped behavior, habit, and self-perception. Under the hat, the head was contained, steadied, and watched over. Its supposed delicacy used to justify a world that insisted women remain carefully, constantly covered. Perspiration was treated as failure. In the Gilded Age, the visible sign of exertion, moist skin, damp hair, flushed temples, was not interpreted as human response, but as lapse in discipline. A woman was expected to move through heat, crowd, and labor without evidence that the body was working at all. The hat played a quiet but essential role in sustaining this illusion. Sweat was associated with labor, and labor with loss of refinement. To appear overheated was to suggest effort where effort was not meant to be seen. Women were permitted to work endlessly, walking long distances, standing for hours, managing households, enduring heavy clothing. But the cost of that work had to remain invisible. The body could tire, but it must not testify. The head was especially dangerous in this regard. Heat gathered there quickly. Hair trapped warmth. Dampness at the scalp betrayed exertion immediately. A sheen along the hairline could undo an entire presentation. The hat concealed this risk, absorbing moisture, masking heat, maintaining dryness where none truly existed. Women learned to manage their bodies with extraordinary precision. Pace was moderated, steps shortened, breath controlled, stops were taken discreetly. The hat allowed these adjustments to remain unseen. Beneath it, the body could struggle quietly without public acknowledgement. This concealment was not comfort, it was containment. Hats were often heavy, lined, and poorly ventilated. They increased heat even as they hid its effects. The irony was accepted without comment. To remove the hat would have revealed sweat, to keep it on intensified it. Either way, the body endured. Only one option preserved appearance. Medical discourse did little to challenge this. Sweating was framed as something to be regulated, not expressed. Excess heat was blamed on temperament or constitution rather than environment. Women were encouraged to cool themselves discreetly, never visibly. The hat ensured compliance. Even faintness was preferable to perspiration. A woman might excuse herself quietly if overwhelmed, but she must not appear undone in public. Dampness was read as loss of control. The hat prevented this reading by maintaining dryness at the most scrutinized point. Class sharpened this expectation. Working women were scrutinized harshly for visible exertion. Wealthy women were expected to transcend heat entirely. In both cases, sweat that showed carried consequence. The hat equalized the performance, hiding effort across differences. Thus, the hat preserved the fiction of effortless grace. It allowed women to move, labor, endure, and overheat without evidence. Sweat existed, but it was not permitted to speak. The body worked in silence beneath layers designed to deny its reality. In this way, the hat became a tool of erasure, not of the woman, but of her effort. It ensured that exertion left no trace, that endurance looked like ease, and that the cost of existing gracefully in a demanding world remained politely unseen. Illness, when it arrived, rarely announced itself clearly. In the Gilded Age, women were taught to endure discomfort quietly, to mistrust their own sensations, and to translate pain into patience. Symptoms that could not be named were expected to be managed, not spoken. The hat played a subtle role in sustaining this silence. Headaches were common, yet rarely discussed. Dizziness passed without remark. Pressure behind the eyes, ringing in the ears, sudden waves of fatigue. These experiences were absorbed into daily life, folded into routine as inconveniences rather than warnings. To complain too freely was to risk being labeled delicate, unstable, or worse, attention-seeking. Medical language offered little refuge. Many ailments were described vaguely, attributed to nerves, temperament, or feminine constitution. Such terms explained nothing while excusing everything. A woman learned quickly that clarity was not expected of her suffering. Endurance was. The hat concealed signs that might have demanded acknowledgement: pallor at the temples, tension in the brow, subtle tremors. These were softened beneath felt and shadow. The brim obscured strain. The structure supported posture even when the body faltered. A woman could be unwell without appearing so. This concealment was not always conscious. Over time, women ceased to recognize the threshold at which discomfort became illness. The line blurred. Pain that could be hidden was pain that did not require language. The hat assisted in this erasure, allowing symptoms to pass unnoticed by others and eventually by the self. Silence became adaptive. A woman who named her illness risked intervention that offered little relief and much scrutiny. Doctors might prescribe rest, removal from activity, or stricter supervision. Social consequences followed. To be ill was to be managed. To remain silent was to retain autonomy, however limited. The hat preserved this autonomy by masking vulnerability. It allowed a woman to continue moving through public space even when unwell. She could attend obligations, fulfill roles, maintain appearances. The cost was internal, borne privately. Importantly, this silence was praised. Women who endured without complaint were admired for strength. Their suffering became invisible virtue. The hat supported this performance, ensuring that illness left no visible mark. Yet the absence of language carried danger. Conditions worsened unnoticed. Fatigue deepened, pain normalized. The body adapted until it could no longer sustain the illusion. When collapse came, it was often sudden, shocking, and treated as inexplicable. In this way, the hat became complicit in a broader system that valued appearance over health, composure over clarity. It allowed illness to exist without recognition, pain without permission to speak. Illness without language was not resilience. It was survival shaped by expectation. Beneath the hat, symptoms waited, unspoken and unresolved, held in place by fabric and habit until the body itself demanded acknowledgement that society had long denied. Scent was never incidental. In the Gilded Age, it carried meaning, judgment, and warning. A woman was expected to smell of care, lightly, deliberately, never of the body itself. The natural odors of heat, exertion, or illness were unacceptable intrusions into public life. Perfume, powder, and felt worked together to manage this invisible frontier. The hat played a central role in this arrangement. Felt absorbed. It trapped moisture, held fragrance, and muffled what could not be allowed to escape. Powder dusted along the hairline, absorbed oil and sweat. Perfume was applied sparingly, often to the hat itself, where it lingered gently without overwhelming. The effect was calculated restraint. Scent signaled discipline. Too much suggested excess or impropriety. Too little risked exposure of the body's own odors, which were treated as evidence of neglect. The correct balance was learned through correction and observation, rarely explained directly. A woman knew she had failed only when a glance lingered or a comment fell slightly off. Perfume was not meant to announce presence. It was meant to neutralize it. Floral notes softened the reality of crowded streets, shared carriages, and overheated rooms. Powder masked exertion, felt sealed it all in place. Together, they created an atmosphere of cleanliness that did not rely on comfort, only control. This was particularly important in close quarters. In conversation, scent preceded words. It established impression before voice was heard. A woman who smelled incorrect invited interpretation before engagement. The hat ensured consistency, carrying the same restrained fragrance wherever she went. There was also fear bound up in scent. Disease was believed to travel through air and smell. Strong odors were suspicious. Perfume reassured by replacing the unknown with the familiar. Powder suggested dryness, health, and order. Felt acted as barrier, interposing material between woman and atmosphere. Even at home, these practices persisted. A woman prepared herself for the possibility of being seen at any moment. The hat, once scented, maintained that readiness. It allowed continuity between spaces, preventing the body's realities from emerging unexpectedly. This management of scent required vigilance. Weather altered. Fragrance. Heat intensified it. Dampness spoiled it. Women adjusted constantly, adding powder discreetly, refreshing scent subtly, ensuring nothing betrayed effort or imbalance. Thus, perfume, powder, and felt worked not to beautify, but to sanitize existence. They erased traces of labor, anxiety, and vulnerability. The hat became a vessel for this erasure, holding the acceptable scent of femininity while containing everything else. In a world that demanded purity without acknowledging effort, this quiet chemistry sustained illusion. Beneath felt and fragrance, the body continued its work unseen, while the woman passed through public space, smelling only of composure. Decay was feared not only as an end, but as a process, slow, creeping, and detectable long before it could be named. In the Gilded Age, women were expected to resist this process visibly, to appear untouched by time, fatigue, and deterioration, even as their bodies bore its quiet marks. The hat became one of the most effective shields against this threat, guarding not the body itself, but the signs that it was changing. Aging was not meant to announce itself. Lines, thinning hair, dullness of skin, these were interpreted not as natural progression, but as failures of maintenance. A woman was permitted to grow older, but not to look as though she were doing so. The hat intervened at precisely this point, masking transitions that society preferred not to confront directly. Hair loss could be concealed beneath structure. Color could be disguised in shadow. Changes in texture disappeared under felt and ribbon. The hat preserved continuity, allowing a woman to appear unchanged even as time advanced. This continuity was not vanity, it was protection against erasure. Decay was also associated with illness and moral decline. A woman who appeared worn risked being perceived as careless, overburdened, or unstable. The hat countered this by presenting firmness where softness might otherwise appear. It restored shape where the body had begun to yield. Even environmental decay was addressed through this barrier. Pollution dulled hair. Dust settled into skin. Dampness encouraged deterioration. The hat shielded against these assaults, maintaining the appearance of freshness longer than the body alone could manage. Cleanliness, once achieved, was preserved. Importantly, this preservation was visual, not restorative. The hat did not halt decay, it delayed its recognition. This delay mattered enormously in a society that rewarded stability and punished visible decline. A woman who appeared unchanged retained her place, one who did not risk marginalization. Women understood this instinctively. They selected hats that reinforced firmness, height, and clarity of outline. Softness was controlled, sagging was corrected. The head remained upright, framed, intact. The message was clear. Nothing here is collapsing. The emotional toll of this vigilance was considerable. The body aged regardless. Fatigue accumulated. Yet the shield held, and so decay remained unspoken. A woman might feel herself changing while presenting constancy to the world. Thus, the hat functioned as a bulwark against acknowledgement. It preserved the illusion of permanence in a culture deeply unsettled by female aging. Beneath it, time passed. Above it, continuity was maintained. A shield against decay did not promise renewal, it promised delay. And in that delay, women found space to remain visible, respected, and intact in a world that demanded they resist change without ever admitting its inevitability. Discipline did not always arrive as command. More often, it entered quietly, carried on small, sharp objects pressed close to the skin. Hairpins were among the most unremarked instruments of order in the Gilded Age, slender, metallic, and relentless in their purpose. They held more than hair in place. They trained the body to submit. A woman felt the hairpin constantly. It pricked when placed incorrectly. It tugged when the head moved too suddenly. It reminded the wearer, through small, persistent discomforts, to remain aware of herself. The pain was never enough to justify complaint, but sufficient to enforce restraint. In this way, discipline became physical, immediate, and difficult to ignore. Hairpins enforced stillness. A careless tilt of the head threatened collapse. A quick turn risked loosening the arrangement. The body learned to move cautiously, not because caution was virtuous, but because disobedience was punished instantly. The head became a site of regulation, governed by balance rather than instruction. This discipline extended into posture. Shoulders were held steady to support the weight above. The neck remained upright. Slouching endangered the structure. Over time, these adjustments settled into habit. The body aligned itself around the demands of what rested on the crown. The hat relied on hairpins to maintain its authority. Without them, it slipped, shifted, betrayed effort. With them, it remained fixed, unmoving, authoritative. The pins disappeared from view, their work unnoticed, their presence felt only by the wearer. This invisibility mirrored the discipline they enforced, essential, constant, and unacknowledged. Women learned early that discomfort was preferable to disorder. A pin pressing too hard could be endured. A hairstyle collapsing in public could not. This calculation shaped behavior far beyond grooming. Endurance was rewarded, complaint was discouraged. The body adapted by absorbing strain silently. Hairpins also symbolized control over the self. Hair, left free, was expressive and unpredictable. Pins subdued it. They organized strands into obedience, rendering them safe for public display. Each pin was a small act of containment, repeated daily until it felt natural. The discipline was cumulative. Over years, the scalp hardened to pressure. Sensitivity dulled. What once caused pain became merely sensation. The body adjusted itself to expectation, learning to accommodate discomfort as background rather than signal. This adaptation was praised. Women who bore such arrangements without visible strain were admired for composure. The effort required was erased, replaced by the appearance of ease. The pins did their work unseen, ensuring that discipline looked effortless. Thus, hairpins enforced more than hairstyles. They taught women to tolerate constant, low-level discomfort in service of appearance. They transformed restraint into habit, endurance into virtue, and compliance into instinct. In this way, discipline did not need to be taught loudly. It was worn daily, pressed into place, carried silently beneath felt and ribbon, sharp, precise, and effective. Containment was never described as confinement. In the Gilded Age, it was presented as order, as care, as refinement applied gently from above. Yet the effect was unmistakable. The head, seat of thought, expression, and recognition, was kept carefully contained, managed not through force, but through habit so ingrained it felt voluntary. The hat completed this containment. It enclosed the head within structure, limiting not only movement, but possibility. Hair was bound, pinned, compressed. The skull was capped, weighted, steadied. The mind beneath it was expected to follow suit, calm, restrained, obedient to circumstance. This expectation was rarely stated outright. It did not need to be. A woman learned early that agitation showed first in the head. Anger lifted the chin. Anxiety tightened the jaw. Excitement animated the eyes. These signs were dangerous. The hat muted them, discouraging extremes by making them physically inconvenient. Sudden emotion threatened balance. A sharp movement could shift pins, loosen structure, reveal effort. The body responded by smoothing itself, settling, regulating. Emotion became something to be managed internally, not expressed outwardly. The head, kept contained, enforced this discipline continuously. Containment also served social clarity. A woman whose head remained still, properly framed, was easier to read as respectable. She appeared composed regardless of inner state. This composure was mistaken for temperament rather than recognized as sustained effort. The hat maintained this illusion reliably. Medical thought supported the practice. Excess thought, excitement, or emotional disturbance were believed to tax the nervous system. The head, already considered fragile, required regulation. Containment was framed as protective. A steady head produced a steady woman. The hat symbolized this stability, sitting like a lid on potential disorder. Women absorbed this logic deeply. They learned to monitor their own reactions, suppressing visible response before it reached the face. The hat aided this self-surveillance, its presence a constant reminder to remain contained. Importantly, containment was praised as virtue. A woman who remained calm under pressure was admired. Her restraint was interpreted as moral strength. The effort required to maintain that restraint went unacknowledged. The head was contained so thoroughly that even its labor disappeared. Over time, the contained head became naturalized. A woman felt exposed without structure above her. Thought seemed too close to the surface. Emotion felt unguarded. The absence of containment produced unease, as though something essential had been removed. Thus, the hat did more than cover. It organized, it disciplined, it enclosed the head in expectation and habit, ensuring that what occurred within remained private, regulated, and unseen. The head kept contained was not protected from thought, but from expression. In this containment, women learned to endure complexity silently, carrying ideas, emotions, and fatigue beneath a structure designed to ensure none of it escaped. What rested on the head shaped what lived beneath it. And so the containment continued, quiet, constant, and complete. Permission in the Gilded Age was rarely granted outright. It arrived instead through compliance, through visible alignment with expectation. Fashion became one of its most reliable carriers. A woman did not ask whether she might enter a space, speak in a gathering, or move freely through the city. She demonstrated eligibility. The hat was her credential. To appear properly dressed was to signal readiness, not readiness to be heard, but readiness to be tolerated. Fashion translated private adherence into public acceptance. The hat, positioned at the highest point of the body, announced this adherence before any other detail could be registered. It said, without language, that the wearer understood the rules and would not disturb them. This permission was conditional and constantly renewed. A woman earned it each time she stepped outside, each time she crossed into view. The hat ensured continuity. It carried evidence of conformity from one space to the next, allowing passage without interruption. Without it, the question of permission reappeared. Importantly, fashion did not grant freedom, it granted access. A woman could attend, observe, participate within narrow limits. The hat made this participation possible by assuring others that boundaries would be respected. It functioned as reassurance more than adornment. This dynamic was especially visible in spaces of mixed authority, shops, offices, institutions, where women were present but not in control. The hat established legitimacy. It allowed a woman to be taken seriously enough to transact, to inquire, to move without obstruction. Improper dress invited dismissal before engagement began. Permission also extended to mobility. Streets, trains, and public venues were more navigable when one appeared appropriately attired. The hat reduced friction, smoothing interactions that might otherwise turn hostile or questioning. It was easier to pass unnoticed than to be challenged. Fashion as permission required precision. Too little effort suggested disregard. Too much suggested ambition. Both risked denial. The hat had to be correct, not impressive. It had to align with context, time of day, and company. Women learned to read these cues carefully, adjusting themselves accordingly. This vigilance was exhausting, but necessary. Without permission, the consequences accumulated quietly. Access narrowed, movement slowed, opportunities diminished. The hat prevented this erosion by maintaining constant eligibility. Over time, women internalized this system. Permission felt earned rather than imposed. The hat became a reassurance to the wearer as much as to observers. It confirmed that she belonged, that she would not be questioned unnecessarily. Thus, fashion functioned as gatekeeper. It regulated who could enter, who could linger, who could pass without remark. The hat stood at the center of this. Regulation transforming appearance into authorization. In a society that rarely said yes explicitly, women learned to wear yes upon their heads, carefully shaped, correctly placed, and renewed each time they stepped into view. Respectability was never free. It demanded payment in time, money, attention, and endurance, extracted quietly and repeatedly until its cost felt inevitable. In the Gilded Age, women paid this price daily, and the hat was both receipt and proof of purchase. The expense was immediate. Hats required materials that aged poorly and demanded replacement, felt warped, ribbons faded, feathers frayed. Fashion shifted with seasons, and respectability shifted with it. To remain acceptable, a woman had to keep pace. Falling behind invited notice. Notice invited judgment. The price was not optional. Beyond money, there was labor. Hats did not maintain themselves. They required brushing, reshaping, storage, careful handling. Moisture ruined them. Heat distorted them. A careless hand crushed them. Women learned to move around their hats as though around fragile instruments, protecting them even as they wore them. Time vanished into preparation. Hair had to be arranged precisely to support the structure above it. Pins placed correctly. Balance tested. Adjustments made and remade until the mirror agreed. This work was unpaid, unacknowledged, and expected. To appear effortless required sustained effort, and the hat demanded its share. There was also physical cost. Weight pressed on the neck. Pins bit into the scalp. Heat accumulated beneath felt and lining. Discomfort became background noise, accepted as the price of appearing correct. A woman who complained revealed that she counted the cost, which itself was frowned upon. Respectability exacted psychological payment as well. Constant vigilance eroded ease. Women monitored themselves continuously, posture, expression, movement, ensuring nothing threatened the structure above. The had enforced this vigilance, punishing inattention immediately. One learned to anticipate correction before it arrived. Importantly, the price was not distributed equally. Wealth softened the burden but did not remove it. Poverty sharpened it, turning maintenance into strain. A working woman might repair the same hat repeatedly, investing time to compensate for lack of means. Failure to do so carried heavier penalties, yet despite its cost, respectability was pursued relentlessly. The alternative, social exclusion, suspicion, diminished opportunity, was more expensive still. The hat became a calculated investment, a visible assurance that the price had been paid. What made this system endure was its framing. The cost was described as preference, as taste, as natural inclination. Women were said to enjoy these rituals, to find satisfaction in refinement. This narrative obscured the extraction beneath it. Thus, the price of respectability was paid quietly, daily, and without receipt. The hat stood as evidence that the transaction had occurred. It did not announce the cost, it concealed it. In this way, respectability functioned as a subscription rather than a purchase, ongoing, unforgiving, and easily revoked. And so, women continued to pay, adjusting, enduring, and presenting themselves correctly, because the price of stopping was always higher. Every system reveals itself most clearly in its response to defiance. In the Gilded Age, women who stepped outside without hats, or who wore them incorrectly, carelessly, or with visible resistance, did not need to announce rebellion. The world responded for them. The woman who broke the rule was rarely confronted outright. There were no shouts, no formal rebukes. Instead, correction arrived through atmosphere. Conversations shortened. Eyes lingered a fraction too long. Politeness thinned. What had once been neutral space grew subtly hostile. She felt it before she understood it. A bareheaded woman. Unsettled the visual order. She appeared unfinished, exposed, unpredictable. Observers struggled to place her correctly, and this uncertainty bred suspicion. Was she careless, defiant, unstable? The absence of proper covering invited interpretation far beyond the act itself. Importantly, the transgression did not need to be total. A hat worn at the wrong angle, out of season, or without proper maintenance could produce the same effect. Disorder at the crown suggested disorder beneath. Society did not tolerate ambiguity well, especially when presented by women. Those who broke the rule often did so unintentionally at first. Fatigue, poverty, illness, or haste might lead to omission. The response taught quickly. A woman who experienced the shift in treatment rarely repeated the mistake. Correction, once felt, did not require explanation. For those who persisted, the consequences accumulated. They were spoken about rather than spoken to. Their behavior became narrative. Small deviations were remembered, exaggerated, woven into reputation. The woman herself faded behind the story told about her. There were, of course, women who broke the rule deliberately. Artists, radicals, reformers. Their defiance was read as threat rather than choice. Bareheadedness became symbolic, a rejection of containment that unsettled more than it inspired. Society responded by isolating them, framing them as anomalies rather than alternatives. The cost of this isolation was high. Access narrowed, safety diminished. The world became sharper, less forgiving. Many who challenged the rule paid with comfort, opportunity, and protection. Thus, rule-breaking functioned as its own warning. It demonstrated what the system could withdraw when compliance ceased. The hat, once seen as burden, revealed itself as shield only in its absence. The lesson was clear and deeply internalized. Survival lay not in resistance, but in negotiation. Most women learned to bend within the rule rather than break it, outright. And so the system endured, not because no one challenged it, but because those who did were made examples of, quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. Enforcement did not always wear a uniform. In the Gilded Age, some of the most effective guardians of order stood behind padded counters, hands dusted with chalk, eyes trained not only on fabric, but on people. Milliners enforced the code quietly, without threat or decree, shaping compliance through suggestion, omission, and approval. A woman entering a millinery shop was already submitting herself to judgment. The mirrors did not lie, but they also did not speak. That role belonged to the milliner. With a practiced glance, she assessed age, class, posture, and intent. From these details, she determined what should and should not be offered. Certain hats never appeared in certain hands. A style too assertive was gently redirected. A color too bold was described as unflattering. A brim too low was deemed severe. Correction arrived wrapped in concern, phrased as expertise rather than refusal. The customer left, believing the choice had been hers. Milliners learned early how far to guide without provoking resistance. Their authority depended on trust. To challenge them was to risk choosing incorrectly alone. Most women deferred willingly, grateful for the protection this guidance offered against public misjudgment. The shop itself reinforced this power. Lighting softened flaws. Arrangement suggested hierarchy. Approved styles occupied central positions. Risky ones lingered at the edges. Even silence communicated preference. What was not recommended carried meaning. Milliners also enforced maintenance. A woman returning with a damaged hat was advised discreetly. Repairs were suggested not as aesthetic improvement, but as necessity. Neglect was corrected before it became visible. The hat was restored not only to shape, but to acceptability. Importantly, milliners were rarely questioned because they appeared to serve fashion, not morality. Their enforcement was invisible, embedded in commerce, yet they translated social rules into physical form daily, ensuring that hats entering public space aligned with expectation. In this way, milliners functioned as gatekeepers, shaping who appeared correctly and who did not. They enforced the rule without naming it, ensuring that order remained intact while appearing purely decorative. Thus, behind every properly worn hat stood a silent enforcer, guiding, correcting, and maintaining the boundaries that society refused to articulate aloud. Armor is often imagined as rigid, metallic, and openly defensive. The hat was none of these things, and yet it performed the same essential function. In the Gilded Age, it absorbed impact, deflected threat, and allowed its wearer to move through hostile terrain with reduced injury. Its strength lay precisely in its softness. Social interaction was not neutral, ground. It carried risk of misinterpretation, intrusion, and judgment. A woman entered this field already disadvantaged, her presence subject to scrutiny before her intention could be known. The hat intervened, taking the first contact so the woman herself did not have to. As armor, the hat did not repel outright. It softened, it redirected, it absorbed attention that might otherwise land too sharply. Remarks slid off ornament, glances caught on brim and feather. The face beneath remained intact, shielded from the full force of observation. This protection was especially important in unfamiliar environments. A woman entering a new neighborhood, a crowded street, or a public institution relied on her hat to announce legitimacy. It reassured others that she belonged within the boundaries of acceptable presence. Without this signal, she would have faced interrogation, spoken or otherwise. The hat also guarded against assumption. It provided context where none existed. Before a woman could be mistaken for careless, immodest, or improper, the hat corrected the impression. It spoke on her behalf, asserting alignment with expectation before misunderstanding could form. Armor must be maintained to function. A damaged hat weakened protection. A poorly chosen one left gaps. Women learned this quickly. They inspected their armor before stepping out, ensuring that it would withstand the day's demands. Unlike traditional armor, the hat required no overt stance. It protected passively, without confrontation. This was crucial. Open defense would have been interpreted as aggression. The hat's protection operated within social norms, invisible as resistance, effective as shield. Importantly, the armor protected not just against others, but against consequence. A woman who navigated public life correctly encountered fewer obstacles. Interactions remained predictable. Boundaries held. The hat made this possible by absorbing friction that might otherwise escalate. The cost of wearing this armor was constant vigilance. It could not be set aside lightly. Removing it prematurely left the wearer exposed. Women learned to gauge risk instinctively, keeping the armor on until safety was assured. Thus, the hat functioned as social armor, lightweight, elegant, and indispensable. It did not grant power, but it mitigated vulnerability. It allowed women to endure a world that watched relentlessly by ensuring that not every blow landed directly. In a society that demanded grace under pressure, the hat provided just enough protection to survive being seen at all. The city was not built for women to wander unguarded. Its streets narrowed unexpectedly, its crowds pressed without apology, its glances followed without invitation. Movement through such a landscape required calculation. One did not simply walk, one navigated. The hat was essential to this navigation, a tool for passage rather than display. To pass safely through the city was to avoid notice without inviting erasure. A woman had to be visible enough to be recognized as respectable, yet unremarkable enough to escape pursuit. The hat achieved this balance precisely. It placed her within the expected pattern, neither standing out nor disappearing. City streets were dense with variables. A woman might encounter shopkeepers, laborers, clerks, strangers passing in both directions. Each encounter carried the possibility of scrutiny. The hat simplified these interactions by answering questions before they were asked. It signaled propriety immediately, reducing uncertainty and discouraging engagement that might otherwise occur. Movement itself was shaped by this necessity. Women walked with measured pace, neither hurried nor idle. The hat reinforced this rhythm. Sudden movement threatened balance, lingering invited attention. The body adapted to the demands of safe passage, guided constantly by what rested on the head. Crossing districts intensified this need. Neighborhoods shifted in character quickly. What was acceptable in one street might be questionable in another. The hat offered continuity, allowing a woman to move between spaces withat renegotiating her presence each time. It acted as a portable credential, valid across boundaries. Public transport, markets, and thoroughfares all posed their own risks. In crowded areas, the hat created a small zone of authority. Others adjusted unconsciously, recognizing the signal of respectability and stepping around it. Without this signal, a woman risked being treated as obstacle rather than person. There was also the matter of self-perception. Passing safely required confidence, even when confidence was difficult to summon. The hat provided this as well. It reassured the wearer that she was properly equipped, that she would not be questioned unnecessarily, that she could proceed. Women learned the routes that required more vigilance. Certain streets demanded firmer posture, a more precise hat angle, fewer pauses. The city became a map of risk and relative safety, navigated daily with practiced awareness. Importantly, safe passage did not imply comfort, it meant absence of incident. A woman who passed through the city safely returned home unchanged, unremarked upon, intact. This outcome was considered success. Thus, the hat functioned as travel gear, as essential as shoes. It allowed women to traverse environments that were not designed for their ease. It reduced danger not by removing it, but by managing exposure to it. Passing through the city safely was an act of endurance, repeated daily. The hat made this endurance possible, allowing women to move through watched spaces with minimal disruption, leaving no trace beyond their passage. There was a particular quiet that accompanied the moment a hat was finally removed. It was not the silence of absence, but of release, measured, cautious, and never immediate. In the Gilded Age, removal marked the end of vigilance, but only after safety had been confirmed beyond doubt. A woman did not lift her hat the moment she crossed a threshold. Walls alone did not guarantee privacy. Doors remained open. Servants moved in and out. Visitors might arrive unannounced. The hat stayed on until the space proved itself stable, predictable, and beyond scrutiny. When removal came, it was deliberate. Pins were loosened slowly, mindful of their grip. Fingers worked carefully, preserving shape and order even in rest. The hat was placed gently aside, never discarded. It remained present in the room, a reminder of the boundary just crossed. The physical sensation of removal was unmistakable. Pressure lifted from the scalp, heat escaped, muscles softened. The head felt suddenly lighter, exposed in a way that was both relieving and unsettling. The body registered the change immediately, shifting posture as though something essential had been taken away. Emotion followed. Without the hat, expression felt closer to the surface. The face responded more freely. Eyes widened, the jaw loosened. This vulnerability was acceptable only in trusted space. To remove the hat elsewhere would have invited misreading. This moment revealed the true function of the hat by contrast. Its absence made visible how much it had contained. Thoughts flowed differently. Reactions surfaced more easily. The self expanded slightly, no longer held in by structure and expectation. Even then, complete relaxation was rare. Many women kept their hair pinned, their posture controlled, their movements measured. The habits enforced by the hat did not dissolve instantly. Discipline lingered long after the object was set aside. Removing the hat also marked a shift in identity. Public self gave way to private self, though the boundary was never absolute. The woman remained aware that she would soon need to don the armor again. The reprieve was temporary. This cycle repeated daily. The hat was worn, endured, removed, and restored. Each removal affirmed that the labor had been worthwhile, that safe passage had been achieved, respectability maintained, exposure survived. Thus, removing the hat at last was not an ending, but a pause, a brief return to selfhood unobserved. The relief it offered was quiet, fleeting, and deeply earned, measured not in freedom, but in the absence of demand. Choice was spoken of often, but it arrived already narrowed. In the Gilded Age, women were told they preferred their hats, that they selected them with delight, that fashion offered expression rather than instruction. This language softened reality. What appeared as choice was, in truth, a carefully maintained illusion. A woman could choose color, height, trim, and texture, within limits so rigid they rarely required enforcement. She could choose which hat, but not whether to wear one. That decision had already been made by custom, expectation, and consequence long before she reached the mirror. This illusion was powerful precisely because it felt personal. A woman believed her hat reflected her taste, her mood, her identity. In some small measure, it did. But these expressions occurred inside a framework that punished deviation. Choice existed only where outcomes remained acceptable. Milliners reinforced this illusion gently. Options were presented as abundant, while unacceptable alternatives never appeared. Guidance masqueraded as expertise. Correction arrived disguised as advice. A woman left believing she had chosen freely, unaware of how much had already been decided for her. The illusion also protected the system itself. If hats were worn by choice, then obligation did not exist. Discomfort became voluntary. Compliance became preference. Critique dissolved before it could form. A woman who questioned the necessity of the hat appeared ungrateful for her own supposed freedoms. Even resistance was absorbed into this framework. A woman who selected a slightly bolder style was seen as expressive, not defiant. Minor deviations were tolerated because they reinforced the idea of flexibility. The boundary held precisely because it allowed small variations within it. Over time, the illusion became internal. Women no longer distinguished between desire and necessity. The hat felt wanted because it felt required. To imagine leaving the house without one provoked unease that felt instinctive rather than imposed. The system no longer needed reinforcement. It lived inside the body. This internalization was the illusion's greatest success. When enforcement becomes preference, resistance becomes unthinkable. A woman adjusted herself automatically, believing she was acting in her own interest, unaware of how thoroughly her interest had been shaped. Thus, the illusion of choice sustained the rule without visible force. The hat remained on the head not because it had to be, but because it felt right. And what feels right rarely invites questioning, even when it has been carefully taught. The disappearance did not arrive as rebellion. There were no announcements, no decisive break, no single moment when women collectively lifted their heads and stepped bare into the street. The vanishing happened quietly, unevenly, almost apologetically, like a rule losing its authority before anyone dared name it. At first, hats merely softened, brims narrowed, structures lightened, weight reduced. What had once been architectural began to look provisional. The head was still covered, but less decisively, as though society itself were uncertain how firmly it wished to hold on. This uncertainty emerged alongside broader shifts. Streets grew faster, work more visible, lives less confined to drawing rooms and predictable schedules. Women moved with greater urgency. The rituals that once governed every threshold began to chafe against speed. Hats that demanded constant adjustment no longer suited days that required motion. Practicality entered the conversation disguised as modernity. Lighter hats were praised as sensible. Simpler styles were framed as progress rather than resistance. The language remained careful. No one said the old rules were unnecessary. They said circumstances had changed. Yet beneath this language, something more fundamental was occurring. The head, once treated as something to be guarded at all costs, was being renegotiated. Exposure no longer carried the same immediate threat. The gaze still existed, but its authority weakened. Observation no longer guaranteed consequence. Women tested this gradually. A hat removed briefly outdoors, a walk taken without full preparation. Each small deviation recalibrated expectation. When punishment failed to arrive, confidence grew. The absence of correction mattered more than approval ever had. Importantly, the vanishing was uneven. Some women held fast, continuing to wear hats long after necessity faded. For them, the hat remained armor, habit, reassurance. To remove, it felt like stepping into danger that memory insisted was real, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Others discarded hats quickly, embracing the relief of uncovered heads. The sensation was disorienting. Light struck differently. Wind touched skin directly. The body felt suddenly accountable for itself without mediation. Freedom arrived without instruction, and many were unsure how to inhabit it. The social meaning of the uncovered head shifted slowly. What once signaled impropriety came to suggest modernity, confidence, even professionalism. The rule did not disappear so much as invert. The hat became optional, then symbolic, then outdated. Yet traces remained. Posture stayed disciplined. Movement remained measured. The habits formed under years of containment did not vanish with the object itself. Women carried the rule inside long after they stopped wearing it. Thus, when hats began to vanish, what truly disappeared was not fabric, but certainty. The clear markers that once governed public presence blurred. Women gained space, but also responsibility, for interpretation, for boundary setting, for exposure previously managed for them. The vanishing was quiet, incomplete, and irreversible. A rule that had shaped generations dissolved not through confrontation, but through gradual disuse. And in its absence, women stood uncovered, carrying forward the memory of weight long after it had been lifted. Looking back, it is tempting to remember the hats as excess, as indulgence, as decoration piled high in an age that delighted in surface. Yet this memory is incomplete. What those elegant forms truly concealed was not frivolity, but necessity, carefully disguised so it could be endured. The hat survived for as long as it did because it solved problems that were never spoken aloud. It managed exposure in a world that watched women relentlessly. It regulated bodies expected to endure without visible effort. It protected reputations that could be damaged by a glance, a rumor, a misreading. It offered safety without admitting danger. Elegance made this possible. Beauty softened enforcement. Ornament distracted from function. The hat did its work precisely because it did not look like work. It appeared chosen, admired, even desired. This appearance allowed obligation to persist without resistance. Women were not deceived in any simple sense. Many understood, at least intuitively, what the hat provided. They felt the difference when it was removed too soon, worn incorrectly, or absent entirely. The world responded immediately. Safety was never abstract. It was experienced daily, measured in how smoothly one moved through space, how little attention lingered, how rarely explanation was required. What made the system enduring was its politeness. Nothing about it felt violent. There were no commands, no punishments that could be named. Instead, there were atmospheres, expectations, and consequences that arrived without announcement. The hat navigated these conditions with remarkable efficiency. Over time, necessity hardened into tradition. What began as protection became propriety. What was once adaptive became moralized. Women were told they wore hats because they were elegant, refined, correct. The deeper reasons faded from language, even as they continued to shape behavior. When the necessity finally weakened, when streets changed, gazes lost authority, and women claimed new forms of presence, the hat fell away. Not because it had never mattered, but because the conditions that required it had shifted. Its disappearance marked not a rejection of elegance, but the loss of its original function. Yet the habits it formed lingered. The self-monitoring, the measured movement, the instinct to manage visibility. These did not vanish with the object. They lived on in posture, expectation, and memory. Elegance that hid necessity leaves traces. It shapes behavior long after the ornament is gone. It teaches endurance disguised as grace, restraint framed as taste, survival rendered beautiful enough to be praised. The hats of the Gilded Age were not trivial. They were answers to a world that demanded women be seen without being harmed, present without being claimed, visible without being consumed. They solved this problem quietly, daily, and at considerable cost. To remember them only as fashion is to miss their true purpose. They were not worn because women loved them. They were worn because women needed them. And in that truth, elegance becomes something else entirely. Not decoration, but evidence of adaptation in a world that offered little room to stand unguarded.